All right, folks, we're back on the air. We've got Larry E. Arnold talking about spontaneous human combustion. Welcome to the show, sir. You are on the air.
Thank you, Sean. So absolutely delighted to be with you and your audience this evening. We have a hot topic to discuss, don't we?
A hot topic, yes, we do. I smoke cigars, and ever since I started reading about this, I've never really been interested, but I was looking into it for this interview, and I've had a twinge on the back of my mind of am I going to combust? So
it's an unnerving subject. The odds are in favor, though, that you're not going to have that happen to you tonight.
So, how did you get involved in this topic? I mean, it's an interesting topic, and it's one that, I mean, you've actually written an entire book on this. What was the thing that spurred you into this? I mean, what was the driving attraction, the driving force in this?
Innate curiosity about things that seem to have fairly decent documentation to back up the allegation, the claim, the event, and if it falls outside the understanding or the acceptance of mainstream orthodox science, then that intrigues us all the more. And certainly SponCom fits that criterion. We were introduced to the subject when we were in junior high school. We purchased one of those paperback books for a quarter called Stranger Than Science by Frank Edwards. And in that book, Mr. Edwards wrote a chapter about the Cinder Woman, Mary Hardy Reeser, who he said, evidence contended, burned by spontaneous human combustion in St. Petersburg, Florida in 1951. Classic case at the time, generated a lot of headlines. But we never heard much more about it as we went through secondary school, and when we went to college, we asked some of our professors about it, and they had never heard of the concept of spontaneous human combustion.
Did they look at you funny?
Some of them did, and some of them said basically, well, I don't know about it, but I don't know enough to say it can't happen, which is, a very honest intellectual attitude to take. Mm-hmm. When we left college, we left electrical engineering. We got interested again in spontaneous human combustion, and we decided we'd go down to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., get into the microfilm archives in the newspaper section, and see if whether or not there was supporting documentation from 1951 in the local newspapers down in Florida to support Frank Edwards' chapter about Mrs. Reeser's alleged strange fiery fate. And what we found was that Frank Edwards, being a newspaper man himself, had archived these newspapers and reported the story in his book quite accurately. The officials back in July of 1951 in St. Pete, Florida, were completely mystified about how Mrs. Reeser, who was about a 175-pound widow one night, the following morning was found reduced to a pile of pretty much desiccated powder in her apartment in St. Pete. Her ashes, her 1 foot, few pieces of calcined vertebrae, plus the remnants of the chair in which she had last been known to be seated, weighed less than 10 pounds. And there was minimal fire damage elsewhere in the apartment. And this certainly fit the classic definition of spontaneous human combustion. And so we decided to see whether, Mrs. Reeser was an absolutely unique one-off case, or whether there might be similar cases throughout history that fit the same description of the fate that befell her. And 35 years or so later, we found hundreds of cases that are very similar to what befell Mrs. Reeser in 1951.
Now, a lot of people out there, I've got to ask, I mean, can you go into detail what spontaneous human combustion is exactly? I mean, I've read that there are a million different theories out there, but in a nutshell, I mean, it is where the body just burns. Is that correct, or is there a more in-depth definition to it?
Yeah, great place to start. Let's give you our definition of spontaneous human combustion so that we all have a common ground from which to base the rest of the discussion, and we'll see where we go from here. Our definition of SHC is the phenomenon process whereby a person can smoke, blister, or otherwise combust in absence of contact with a known, identifiable, nearby external ignition source or burn agent. That is, the person burns, blisters, or smokes in the absence of contact with a flame, in the absence of caustic chemicals or radioactive material or high amperage or a nearby known radiant heat source. If you can rule out those common situations that can lead to burning of the flesh, then you need to look at spontaneous human combustion.
Now, I've read, now with that definition, that rules out a lot of the more commonly, I should say, the orthodox explanations of it. I've read that there are alcohol poisoning, wicking, where if you drop, they say it's wicking if you drop a cigarette. I wish you would explain that one for me. Wicking, and then static electricity. But what you just said rules all of those out. Am I correct?
We would certainly believe so. That's why we like to stick with that definition, so that, as we said, we all are working from common ground. You mentioned the wicking phenomenon, or the wicking theory to explain away spontaneous human combustion. That is by far the most prevalent theory that the naysayers, the debunkers, the so-called skeptics proffer as the explain away for spontaneous human combustion, something that they are really, really uncomfortable having to deal with.
Now, how many times has this been documented throughout history? When did it begin?
Oh, when did it begin? In our book Ablaze, we devote a chapter that looks at mythology and legends with an eye to maybe these being historically accurate accounts of some very strange phenomena involving burning of people. And if we accept those as based on historical fact, we have evidence for spontaneous human combustion going back thousands of years. In Ablaze, we document in excess of, I think the count is around 500 cases, maybe 400 in a book. We found more since the book was published in 1995. I think Ablaze contains about 400 cases that fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion in most cases.
Wow.
A couple of cases we report in the book that were alleged by other reporters, other investigators, journalists to be spontaneous human combustion, and we found evidence that found a prosaic, commonplace, albeit and oftentimes very bizarre situation, not spontaneous human combustion, but very strange fire deaths nonetheless. So we're not a mystery monger, as some of our critics allege. We're not looking to say everybody who burns up has to be a victim of spontaneous human combustion. That would be ludicrous. Unfortunately, in this country alone, about 4,500 people a year are fire fatalities. Very few, if any of them, resemble the classic case of spontaneous human combustion, i.e. like Mrs. Reeser or Dr. John Bentley, also here in Pennsylvania, or many other cases that we document in depth in our book Ablaze.
Now, when we look at the classic, can you run over what the classic scenario is? I mean, it entails the fact that nothing else is burnt. That is part of it, isn't it?
That's part of the classic scene, and thank you for using the adjective classic. What we're going to be describing next is how many people think of spontaneous human combustion. We found in our research that the phenomenon has a wide variety of aspects and presentations, so that, as we said in our definition originally, a person whose body will blister spontaneously is a victim of spontaneous human combustion, even though that person is able to talk about it and show the blister to a physician or to a next of kin, for example. But the classic case, what most people think of in spontaneous human combustion research, is a fire scene in which the body is almost wholly reduced to powder, desiccated ash, which normally in a retort would require temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees for many hours uninterrupted. At the scene of classic spontaneous human combustion, the body is almost completely obliterated. Perhaps an extremity or two is left, a foot, a hand, perhaps the head, sometimes even shrunken, to indicate that the ash itself once belonged to a human body. The paradox there is that most people think this must require a tremendous amount of heat, and certainly it does in a crematorium's retort. But yet at a classic SHC fire scene, we do not find the evidence of extreme heat near the body. Stacks of newspapers, daybed linen, tar-based linoleum flooring, paint on the ceiling above the point of combustion where the individual incinerated, do not exhibit any kind of extreme heat or fire damage.
That's incredible. You said something that just, it did actually send shivers up my spine, because, coincidentally, now a couple years ago I did burn myself pretty good with some hot grease. actually on my stomach. But about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, I have no way to explain it. I mean, this is for real. No way to explain it. But just above where those burns occurred, I ended up with, it's about 1.5 inches long and about a 1/2 inch wide, that they were burn blisters. And I literally do not know how they got there. I did not burn myself. I did not drop ash on myself. I did not burn myself with more bacon grease. Mm-hmm. But I've got a scar it's still there. I don't know when it's going to go away. It was from about 2 weeks ago. So what causes that? I mean, let's get into the cause of this, because now I'm a little concerned.
We're jumping from the frying pan right into the fire, so to speak. What causes spontaneous human combustion? You alluded to earlier there being 1 million theories. There may well be. We haven't come up with that many ourselves. Blaze documents or suggest about 120 different plausible, possible explanations for the different cases of SponCom that we document. We look at biochemistry, we look at bioelectricity, we look at quantum physics, we look at geotelluric energy patterns, because we have found in some cases, particularly in the United Kingdom, when we plot the locations of very bizarre fires involving humans, animals, and property on a map of the UK, a large percentage of those strange, anomalous fires fall along straight alignments. More than 80% of the cases that we would characterize as bizarre can be connected by straight alignments when plotted on a map. Some alignments extend for several hundred miles across the British landscape.
So are we talking almost like a ley line energy, earth energy type thing?
In that context, it's very there is certainly an analogy to the ley line concept, whereas leys connect megalithic sites and sacred sites, and some people, particularly dowsers and some geomantics, would suggest that we're dealing with a telluric, a real earth energy that geophysicists have yet to identify. We see a similar pattern involving pyrophenomena. We simply believe that's a different vibratory energy, but similar in nature and in concept to the ley line.
Now, is there a chance that this is actually, I was reading that there's something called mitochondria, that this could actually be our cells, our own bodies, actually heating up. What do you think about that?
We think that's a plausible avenue. We have been looking into that for a number of years. Each cell each living cell is a bioelectrical generator and has a minute electrical potential across the cell wall. And if the mitochondria or some other factor in the cell structure would cause that electrical potential to discharge simultaneously through the millions or even billions of cells in the body, theoretically we posit we could be looking at a very high amperage electrical surge in the body that the body's physiology simply could not transmit, and basically you're frying yourself electrically from the inside out at the cellular level.
Now, these bodies, they burn hotter than what you would have in a crematorium. Is that correct?
Well, we can't say the body burns hotter than the heat that a cadaver is exposed to in a retort. We simply have no evidence, sadly, from any on-scene investigator or researcher or observer when one of these rare fire fatalities occur with a pyrometer to measure what that temperature is. It may be a low heat, but something that, as we just discussed, bioelectrically or biochemically, it causes the body to do this and does not generate a lot of thermogenesis attendant to the phenomenon that dehydrates the body's cellular structure. On the other hand, it may be a very, very high, intensely hot heat, but it occurs so rapidly that there's no time for that high heat to transmit to nearby combustible objects and cause them to ignite.
Now, would you share with us a few of the more infamous incidences or the more
The ones the skeptics would characterize as infamous.
Sure, please.
We'd be delighted to. Let's preface one of the cases. In fact, it was the case that after Mrs. Reeser got us personally intrigued by this phenomenon and set us on a new career direction. We discussed earlier the human wick theory that allays the belief in and the need to believe in spontaneous human combustion. There's a world-renowned international forensicologist named Dr. Mark Benecke, and he has written and he has told us face-to-face that in his alleged investigation of 200 alleged cases of spontaneous human combustion, he has never found a case in which the internal organs of a burned corpse are damaged more severely than the outer parts of the body. He has said that to us, and he's written that in print. And based on that observation or claim of his, he rules out spontaneous human combustion because the practical observation, he says, is proof that combustion can never start from inside the human body. Therefore, these people do not spontaneously combust, but they are victims of the wick effect in which they've dropped a cigarette on themselves, or an arson murderer has doused them with gasoline and torched the body and walked away, and hours later the body slowly smolders into dry powder. Our response initially to that is, if that were indeed the case and it was so easy to burn a body in that fashion, crematorium operators would not be spending $100,000 on a retort and buying 50 or 60 gallons of fuel oil to incinerate their customer. Thinking of Dr. Benecke's comment that internal organs are never burned more severely than the outer parts of the body, and therefore we can dismiss this silly notion of spontaneous human combustion, let us come back to your question and share with you and your listeners the case of Dr. John Bentley. He was a retired physician, 92 years of age, back in December of 1966, living in north central Pennsylvania, our home state. On the morning of December 5 of that year, Don Gosnell, a meter reader for the local gas company, walked up, knocked on Dr. Bentley's front door, entered the home, and went down to Dr. Bentley's basement to read the gas meter, as he did every month. Don Gosnell was an active firefighter in the community of Coudersport at the time, and when he was walking down the hallway of Dr. Bentley's home, he noticed that there was a strange, kind of sweet-smelling smoke in the air. He couldn't quite place, didn't think a whole lot more of it. When he was down in the basement, having finished reading the gas meter down there, when he turned, he noticed that in the floor of the earthen basement was a pile of ash about 5 inches in height, 14 inches in diameter, he told us. He walked over, kicked the pile of ash with his work boot, and thought to himself, gee, there must have been a fire in the house overnight. Wonder why me and my fellow firefighters didn't get a fire call. He looked above the pile of ash on the earthen floor and noticed that there was about a 2 by 3 foot hole in the basement ceiling with some cherry red embers around the perimeter. Mr. Gosnell walked back upstairs down the hallway of Dr. Bentley's home, and since Dr. Bentley was elderly but very beloved by the locals in the community, Don knocked on Dr. Bentley's living room door, did not get a response. The door was unlocked. Mr. Gosnell opened the door, peered into the living room, and saw no evidence of Dr. Bentley. Stepped inside the gentleman's living room to peer around the corner into the other room of Dr. Bentley's 2-room apartment, which was his bathroom, and there got the shock of his life. On the other side of the hole that he had just looked at from the basement, he was now looking into the bathroom of Dr. Bentley, and lying tangential to that 2 by 3 foot hole was one half of one human leg. And Mr. Gosnell realized at that moment that the ash that he had just kicked down in the basement with his work boot had to have been the ashes of Dr. Bentley. Mr. Gosnell fled the house, ran down the street of Coudersport into his office, and yelled the understatement of the year, Dr. Bentley's burned up. Indeed, Dr. Bentley had, but in a way that made no sense whatsoever to the local fire officials at the time. And it doesn't make sense to fire officials to this day. Dr. Bentley is the poster child, if you will, for spontaneous human combustion because he, along with many other cases, puts the lie to Dr. Benecke's statement that there is no human body that has its internal organs burned more severely than the outer parts. There were no internal organs left at the Dr. Bentley fire scene. There's one half of one leg, a couple pounds of dry powder, and a kneecap. and a head that was so badly burned that the original first responders didn't even recognize it as a human head. Dr. Bentley's ashes and his leg were shoveled into a bag and buried in the nearby town of Gailton. One would think that this would have made headlines at the time. This was an absolutely extraordinary fire scene. And unlike the Reeser case down in Florida back in 1951, the locals up there really didn't talk much about it. And many of the locals never even understood the manner in which Dr. Bentley had left their community. Until we got tipped off the case about 10 years later, went up, talked to everybody that we could find, the first responders, the newspaper editor, the coroner, the deputy coroner. And finally we got a photograph, a couple photographs actually, from a photographer. And this has now become the classic scene of classic spontaneous human combustion. Dr. Bentley's one leg lying next to a hole through which his body burned. Askew atop the hole is Dr. Bentley's aluminum walker. He was semi-invalidic. The aluminum walker is completely intact. The aluminum did not melt, even though it should melt at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. We are in the bathroom of Dr. Bentley's home. Just above the edge of the hole was a bathtub, the old porcelain kind of bathtub that had been painted with enamel paint. We can attest to you, having seen it ourselves, that the paint on the bathtub had not blistered in this fire. There was no heat flame damage directly above the point of combustion on the ceiling. As our skeptics will say, well, Larry, you have to understand that in a fire scene, there's not a lot of radiant heat around the fire source. Heat rises. Well, yeah, we do understand that. So we would expect to see a lot of heat and flame damage to the ceiling because there's a low ceiling in Dr. Bentley's bathroom. The ceiling was practically pristine. And to confirm the oddity of this, which we find in some of the cases, in a normal fatal fire scene involving a human being, most first responders will tell you, as they have told us, that the odor at the scene is very noxious. A burning body does not smell very pleasant. But at Dr. Bentley's fire scene, Don Gosnell told us that there was a sweet, redolent aroma at the home, as there was in the case of Mary Reeser back in 1951 and in many other cases that we document in our book Ablaze. So we had this incredible paradox of what appears to be a very superheated fire that consumes a body, oftentimes very quickly, without producing any surrounding heat damage to combustibles that are much more easily burned than is the human body. We have the absence of the noxious odor characteristic of burned human flesh. Oftentimes it's redolent, perfume-like. In one case, the odor was described to us by the next of kin as smelling like hickory incense at the fire scene.
That's interesting.
And then we had the officials who were just, like scratching their heads, muttering to themselves, how did this happen? Could this have happened? Where's the evidence for arson murder? Where's the evidence for suicide? Where's the evidence for dropped cigarette or smoking mishap? And we don't find it. We don't find it. We don't find it.
Let me ask you really quick, Larry. Can you tell us where all we can find your book to purchase?
Yeah. The easiest places are to either go to Amazon.com and do a search for Ablaze, the mysterious fires of spontaneous human combustion. You can order it through Amazon. Or if you'd like to get it directly from the author and have a signed copy, we still have some first edition copies available. You can contact us either through our website, www.parascience.com, and email us from there, and we'll send you the details on how to get the book. Retails for $24.95. Here's the plug. We're told it reads like a Stephen King mystery novel, except this book is, we would contend, based on 100% historical fact and research. This is not fiction, believe it or not.
That's incredible. I'd like to hear a few more stories. I have a few questions, though, that have arisen. We actually, the show is done in an interactive format. We do this through our forum also. We've got a chat board in there on the shtf411.com chat or forum board. So I want to ask you a few questions regarding spontaneous human combustion.
Okay.
Now you mentioned that the surrounding material or even the ceiling was not burnt. What theories do you believe can explain why there is no surrounding material that burns for the most part.
We come back to the two things that we discussed earlier. Either if there's a very high heat generated in this phenomenon, it's like a flash fire, and the heat dissipates extremely rapidly so that there's no opportunity for nearby combustibles with lower ignition temperatures than the human body would normally have to themselves spontaneously combust. Or it's a type of energy that simply does not lend itself to igniting combustibles, which brings us back to something that occurs wholly within the body with a low temperature, like something that is biochemical or bioelectrically based, or something that happens at the quantum level of the body that causes what we call the human Hiroshima effect, in which the energy is released very, very quickly, but within a limited radius. And most of the cases of classic nature where we've been able to get a handle on the dimensions at the fire scene suggest that this ball of energy radiates from the center point in the body down in the abdominal region of the victim and radiates outward for about 1.5 feet maximum, and then the energy stops. So that whatever is beyond the radius of that fireball never becomes impacted or affected by the heat that consumes the body itself from that point of origin within the body.
How fast would you estimate? You're talking about burn times or actually burn speeds. How long does it take for these people to burn? I mean, I guess no one's watching them burn. Have there been any documented cases of people watching someone else literally burn away? I mean, how fast does this happen?
Actually, there are witnesses to spontaneous human combustion, and the naysayers really don't like to deal with this.
Please tell us.
Their response to the eyewitnesses is, well, they're not expert witnesses, so we don't need to believe it, or it's simply anecdotal testimony, so we dismiss it. And we think again in science, in the history of science, how many thousands and thousands of times, people's anecdotal testimony is dismissed by mainstream science only to eventually become embraced and accepted and say, oh, now we can learn something from this. The classic perhaps is, people claim stones fell from the sky for centuries. Oh, no, air can't support a stone. These people are hallucinating or making things up, or they're misidentifying a stone that's been lying on the ground, forever and forever. Until the early 1800s, when finally some scientist with some academic standing behind him was willing to come forth and says, all these silly peasants who have been pestering us for centuries with tales of stones that fall from the sky, they've got it right. And now we know about meteors and meteorites. So I think with that early level with spontaneous human combustion, We've had the privilege to interview survivors and eyewitnesses of spontaneous human combustion for many a year now. We've come to the conclusion that these people are honest, reputable. They have no hidden agenda. They have the courage and the honesty to come forward and tell us about a situation that they have either seen or experienced personally that is bizarre, is strange. For some of them, it's been incredibly frightening. But without hearing from them what it feels like to know that the body is suddenly beginning to smoke or to blister or to heat internally from within for no one understood reason, is the only way that researchers such as ourselves are going to be able to someday fully understand and appreciate just how this phenomenon can happen, and therefore come up with means by which it might be able to be prevented from happening to others. So what's it like? People have told us that it can feel like an electrical tingling sensation in the body. It can feel like something inside their body is suddenly becoming very hot and moving up their spinal column towards their shoulder, as in the case of an Ohio housewife back in the mid-1990s, Kay Fletcher. It can be what happened to Peter Jones in 1980, one October day twice. He experienced his body suddenly begin to erupt in plumes of smoke, the first time witnessed by his wife Barbara, the second time it happened to him while he was alone in his automobile. Peter Jones is one of those amazing individuals, able to remain incredibly calm under fire. He kind of brushed the smoke off and went about his business, never really thinking about much of what had happened to him until he saw us discussing the case of Dr. Bentley and other classic examples of SponCalm on the ABC program That's Incredible back in 1980, at which point he and his wife Barbara contacted us and told us their amazing story of partial spontaneous human combustion.
How do these survivors put themselves out? I mean, do they have to literally put themselves out, or do some of them just, I mean, do they talk their way to death as they're burning up?
For the survivors, they're pretty much mystified and don't really do anything conscious or physically to attempt to stop the smoking or the heating. The phenomenon ends of its own accord, which is why we have survivors to tell us what it was like. For the fatal cases, we don't know. Were they aware of what was happening to them, and did they try to take some constructive, corrective, preventive action to stop the situation that was developing within their bodies? Or did it happen so quickly that they were completely unprepared and unaware of what happened to them? We have a strong intuitive sense that in some instances, particularly like in the Dr. Bentley case and some of the really extreme classic cases, whatever is the causative mechanism, it happens so quickly, so spontaneously, that the nervous system in the body has no time to react and transmit signals to the brain. So the person is completely oblivious to the fate that is rapidly, engulfing them.
The man you were just discussing, you said Peter James?
Peter Jones.
Jones. Did y'all examine his body? Did he have a medical exam? Was there any documented damage or phenomena that they could actually scientifically document?
Peter Jones, 2 cases, had no physiological damage to his body caused by the smoking. And this is one of the really bizarre cases. What biochemical or bioelectrical process in the body would cause the body to exude something that looks to the observer, and in this case 2 observers, Peter and his wife Barbara, appears to look like bluish white smoke. We're still looking for the answer to that. In other cases, there's a metaphysician from British Columbia who experienced second-degree burning of her body, blistering. She would tell us her body would become so hot that she had to literally soak it in ice water because she was afraid that the burns were going to become more severe. In her case, it was witnessed by a nurse and physicians, but they had no other than to characterize the burns as indeed burns. They would suggest that she must have been near a hot radiator, or somebody had brushed her with a lit cigarette, all of which she steadfastly denied, of course, because those situations were not present. We're left with mysteries, and that's what spontaneous human combustion is at this point, a really intriguing, baffling, burning, flaming fate that belies common sense and understanding at this time.
Are physicians or other scientists, I mean, do you have a list of people looking into this? I mean, my question that comes to mind is, in the cases where they've got body parts with ashes, have there been chemical analyses done to those body parts or the ashes to look for abnormalities?
That's a great question. It's one that has been very frustrating to us because, with one exception that we know of, that kind of toxicological work has never been done. In the Dr. Bentley case, when we got the death certificate, it said that Dr. Bentley died by asphyxiation. And our question immediately upon seeing that to the deputy coroner was, well, where's the trachea? You can't determine asphyxiation without a trachea. And he says, well, there was no trachea. It was part of the ashes. So, a lot of times we found in our research that death certificates are supposedly legal documents that would stand up in court as to cause of death really aren't supportable. We have yet to find a death certificate that says spontaneous human combustion. The closest we've come is a case involving a British derelict in 1974, Mr. Bailey, who was found in a stairwell on the first floor of a tenement building with a bright electric blue-colored jet of flame jetting from his abdomen. And this was witnessed by the firefighters who were called to the fire scene. And this gets back to the skeptics that we mentioned earlier. They say, well, when you have witnesses to these alleged cases of alleged spontaneous human combustion, Larry, you have to understand that they're not professional firefighters. They're not experienced witnesses, so we can dismiss their anecdotal testimony. Well, in this case, Jack Stacy was a fire brigade commander. He and his fire crew stood there and amazed, aghast, looking at this jet of flame, and those are Jack Stacy's words to us, a jet of flame with force emanating from the abdomen of Mr. Bailey, who was probably dead already. They dumped his gut full with the contents of a few fire extinguishers, eventually quelled the jet of blue flame. Because Mr. Bailey, by all accounts, was dead already when the fire crew arrived, we wish they had left the event unfold naturally to see just whether he would have been consumed by this energy, to the full extent that Dr. Bentley and Mary Reeser were. But we'll never know that. But whatever, if you want to dismiss the expert eyewitness testimony of a fire brigade commander in England, who else can you believe at these fire scenes? You can't believe anybody, which brings us back to, there are expert observers, and when we've been studying this phenomena in arson fire science classes, we had two professors, Fred Klages and Buzz Triebold, who are well known in the fire service community here in Pennsylvania. And their collective wisdom to us was, one, always be prepared for the unexpected, to be open-minded, which is very sage advice in any endeavor. They said to always be able to defend your assessment of a fire scene, and we would support that as well. And certainly Jack Stacy was able, professionally to support his observation at the Robert Bailey fire scene. And thirdly, these two fire investigators told us to enjoy and respect a challenge and believe as spontaneous human combustion is a challenge, both the phenomenon itself and dealing with the naysayers and the debunkers who will come up with some really silly, outrageous explanations that are even more bizarre than SponCom itself, just so they don't have to deal with the concept.
I'm listening to this and I'm hearing you mentioned blue flames. I've been reading that there are blue flames, and something that comes to mind is it possibly that they're not seeing blue flames, but it's actually, you were mentioning like ley lines and earth energy. Are we potentially seeing almost like maybe a lightning effect, or is that possibly even an electrical energy that people are seeing?
Quite likely. One reason we've discussed repeatedly tonight with you, the evidence that oftentimes there appears to be not much radiant thermal heat energy associated with these events. And when we use the term flame, we're using it in the broadest context. Oftentimes we believe these quote-unquote fires are not an oxidation-type blaze, which is what you get when you strike a match or when you fire up a gas burner. But rather we're looking at, again, something that is electrical or plasma in nature, or, as you suggest, perhaps associated with the ley line type of energy, something that is telluric, an energy in the planet that sometimes, certainly not always, breaks forth, emanates, and interacts with three-dimensional matter as we recognize it. We do have a case in a book where a lady was burned in the midst of four fellow women in northern Italy, struck down by what appeared to be an energy that was indeed emanating from the ground beneath her feet when the five of them were walking home from toiling in a field one day. In that case, the lady in the middle just basically, according to the eyewitnesses of the four ladies surrounding her, literally exploded in flame, and body parts were flying around.
That's incredible. You mentioned Italy now. Mm-hmm. Is there a pattern? I mean, is this a phenomenon that only happens, let's say, obviously I can't say, does it only happen in the Western Hemisphere, but is it something that's relegated to, say, North America and Europe? Is there any kind of pattern that you've been able to trace as far as you were talking about the straight lines and such, but I mean, are there actual geographic hot spots that you mentioned cases in Pennsylvania and Florida? Are there any kind of patterns that you've been able to figure out?
The attempt to put a pattern to spontaneous human combustion dates back to the 1700s, actually. When French physicians were looking seriously into this concept, most of them argued that cases of spontaneous human combustion were relegated to the Germans. When German scientists were looking into spontaneous human combustion, they argued that almost all cases of spontaneous human combustion afflicted the French. You had this very interesting across the border going on in Europe. And then in 1850 or thereabouts, a German chemist, von Liebig, decided that he was going to put the lie to this once and for all. Did or did not SHC happen? And basically what von Liebig did was to try the Wick effect. And he found he couldn't get the Wick effect to work, and therefore he decided that spontaneous human combustion therefore could not occur. And his judgment has pretty much grounded SHC into dust, if you will, ever since, until our research came along. And what we have found is that while there are indeed many cases attributed to the French, some fewer cases that we've been able to attribute to the Germans, the greatest number of cases per capita of this phenomenon appears to have been occurring in the United Kingdom, Scotland, England, Wales. We certainly have many cases here in the United States that fit the classic definition of SHC. We have cases from all around the world on every continent save Antarctica. And as you well know, there aren't too many people in Antarctica. As for patterns,
Please.
other than the alignment of the 80% of the cases that we have in the UK, Pennsylvania has a number of classic cases. Texas has a few. Florida has a couple. In fact, we keep being told that there are cases that fit the definition of classic spontaneous human combustion that have occurred in Florida that we have been unable to track down. So if any of your listeners might know of a case from 20 or 30 years ago, perhaps even more recent, where a body has been burned inordinately thoroughly at a fire scene that otherwise has minimal, if any, flame or heat damage, please contact us.
Well, to make mention of that, we do have listeners in New Zealand, Australia, of course the United States, England, and Mexico. So they're scattered all over. So hopefully we'll get some feedback. That'd be pretty interesting. I know that a few of them are a little concerned about this topic. It's certainly interesting. Let me ask you regarding stomach gases, methane, natural gas. Have you ever looked into, I'm reading in the SHTF411.com chat room, they're talking, natural gas burns blue. How long, have you done any kind of studies into testing how long, let's say, the gas contained in a human being can burn for?
We personally have not. The answer to that intriguing question might be somewhere online by in somebody's laboratory. If so, we'd certainly be interested in it. We do not have the background to give you a definitive answer. We have, as well as others, have considered diphosphane as a chemical means that would produce possibly a blue appearing flame. Certainly, diphosphane can be generated in the human body. That might be a triggering mechanism for the methane in gastrointestinal fluid or gas. Just a possibility at this point to look at.
Now, one of the people that are listening right now, they've had experience as a mortician. They apparently, I guess, knee bones are something that's left over often in a crematorium type situation. Are the knee bones? I know that their legs are missing, but do you know whether or not the knee bones were present? I guess the patula.
In a normal cremation, we don't know. We do know that what comes out of the retort is not the proverbial dust and ash, but bone fragment, which is then put in a cremulator, which mechanically grounds the bone fragments into powder that's put in the urn to give to the next of kin. In Dr. Bentley's case, besides the half of one leg and the head that was so grotesquely burned that it wasn't recognizable as human, was part of the patella, part of one kneecap. Everything else is burned to powder in the Bentley case. Normally in a crematorium, the parts of the body that are most difficult to burn, according to our understanding, are the teeth, the jaws, and the pelvic bone. We have a case here in outside of Philadelphia years ago in the Schuylkill Expressway where a gasoline-laden tanker collided with a vehicle. The hapless motorist was incinerated, and about 9,000 gallons of burning gasoline. The fire was so hot that the rebar in the concrete roadway buckled up through the concrete. And yet the investigators could identify that victim from dental records that survived that horrible incineration, and were able to identify the deceased motorist. So teeth and the pelvic bone are extremely hard to burn in a normal fire, which makes these rare cases of what by definition would have to be spontaneous human combustion so intriguing, because the teeth are often gone, the pelvic bone almost always is gone. So what makes these rare, infrequent, but highly dramatic cases so different from a normal body exposed to a normal fire? And that's one of the big mysteries of this subject.
Now, I've got my mind just flashed a gruesome thought in my mind, or a picture in my mind. But these body parts that have been left. Two questions. One, some people say, I've read, oh no, these bodies were burned elsewhere, and they simply poured ash out and put the body parts there. They posed them in place. The second part of this is these bones, or the legs that are left, are the ends of them charred, or are they somewhat open flesh?
To your last question first, based on the photographic evidence that has been given to us by fire photographers, by newspaper editors, and by first responders, close-ups of the surviving limbs have never been taken to our knowledge. So photographically, we can't with assurance answer your question, but it appears from the overall long shots that the areas of the body that remain away from the point of most intense combustion have not been severely burned. The dermis will be blistered, the skin will be pulled back and dried and desiccated to some extent, but it doesn't look much like there's been a lot of heat or flame damage to the extremities that survive. As to the first issue you raised, where it's been alleged, particularly in the Reeser case, that the fire scene was salted by a criminal, we have to ask why. Why would a criminal, an arson murderer, go into Mary Reeser's apartment in July of 1951, kill her or remove her from her apartment, burn her somewhere else, and then within the span of a few hours be able to cremate her more completely than could normally be done in a normal crematorium operation, scrape the ashes out, grind them up in a cremulator, put them in a bag, take them back to her apartment and scatter them around, and then leave without ever being detected. It's ludicrous. It just makes no sense. Why would a criminal do that?
Exactly.
We have in our book this wonderful story by a Dr. Strong back in the 1800s here in Pennsylvania. He wanted to find out how difficult it was to destroy a body by fire, a human body. So what he did was get the cadaver of a pirate, hack it into pieces, and start throwing the pieces into a fireplace, a domestic fireplace. He created such an noxious stench that his neighbors called the constabulary, who came by to see what the hell was going on. He explained that this was a scientific endeavor, but Dr. Strong literally worked up a sweat, emotionally as well as physically. over an entire night and well into the following morning, burning up a body by hacking it to pieces and throwing the pieces in a fireplace. It is not easy to burn a human body.
Now, I'm a meat eater, and in my mind, is a human body actually more intense to burn up than, say, animal flesh, or is it about on par?
In experiments that are done to allegedly prove the wick effect, to allay the contention that SHC is real, pigs are often used, and pork is very similar anatomically and biologically and in terms of its burn properties to human flesh. So at least the pig is very akin to the human body in terms of its combustibility and the nature in which fire will burn both organisms.
What about animals? Is this a phenomenon that is strictly with human beings, or does the spontaneous human combustion, is it actually spontaneous organic combustion?
There you go, great. If it's spontaneous human combustion, it has to deal with humans. We have found what we call SAC, spontaneous animal combustion, or your term, spontaneous organic combustion, and like that as well. We have found a few examples. Ivan Sanderson, a world-renowned naturalist, wrote in one of his books upon a walk in the woods discovering a half-burned opossum. Being a naturalist as well as a Fortean, he investigated. He tried to find any kind of an external ignition source that would have caused half of a possum to incinerate in the middle of the woods. He could not find anything. Possibly a case of spontaneous opossum combustion. We have a few cases that we mentioned in our book involving cats, dogs, a sheep, and possibly a bovine, a cow. Interestingly enough, in a case from Wales back in January of 1980, Henry Thomas burned up classically in terms of spontaneous human combustion near his hearth in his home in Wales, which we learned after the fact fell upon a fire lane that we had earlier plotted on our maps by identifying that line, linking some other cases of SHC that we had previously known about. So by following that alignment of strange fires actually led us, in a sense, to a new case of SHC, that of Henry Thomas. The skeptics said that some of the residue from the blaze that was lying over the hearth grate had to be meat that Mr. Thomas had been cooking in his fireplace, and when it was analyzed, it was found to be human. It was found to be bovine. Very interesting case. You asked earlier about whether any remnants of bodies had been analyzed. We didn't complete our answer to your question there. The one case that we do know about where that did happen with some authority was the case of a lady in Bolingbrook, Illinois, in 1979, Beatrice Oski. When the fire marshal, Vince Calcagno, found out about that case when he came back from a weekend vacation, he took a great interest in it because it belied everything he understood could have burned the body in that fashion. He had the limbs of Mrs. Oski analyzed. There was a fair amount of her body left in that incineration. And what he discovered was, A, there was no evidence of an accelerant. In other words, she was not the victim of an arson murder. And the tox came back and said there was also no blood left in the limbs of her body, which he thought was quite curious. That's the case in which the next of kin told us the house smelled like hickory incense when the next of kin returned.
Mm-hmm. Can you actually share with us a little bit more in detail? That's an interesting story. Can you kind of share with us somewhat what occurred there?
Well, the Oski case is intriguing because the local firefighters took an intense interest in the case and were very generous with their time in sharing their time, their expertise, their fire files on that case with us over several days when we went out to meet with them. And this is something else that we do. When possible, we actually go to the fire scene, even if it's years later. We sit down with those who were first responders to get their firsthand recollections. We're not going back to newspapers. We're not looking for source stories. We try to go to the original documentation, the original sources, the first responders whenever possible as we conduct our research. because we were certainly by that time willing to give a lot of credence to the concept of spontaneous human combustion, we were looking at the Oskey case a little bit differently than did the first responders in Bolingbrook. Clocks in the house and a watch on Mrs. Oskey's forearm had stopped, if memory serves, at about 12:15, and the fire was actually discovered just shortly after 12:30 on Thanksgiving weekend, 1979. And the first responders were, as they were talking to us, they thought, well, this fire must have occurred over 12 hours. That's a fairly long time. Maybe she smoldered for 12 hours, which is what the wick effect would call for. But they were still perplexed by the degree of incineration, the lack of significant heat damage overhead, a lot of other problems at the fire scene. And to them that they were assuming that her wristwatch stopped at 12:15 a.m. and the body was discovered at 12:30 p.m. approximately. And we mentioned to them, and it was interesting to watch Vince Calcagno, the fire marshal at the time, just as we were about to suggest that this watch stopped not at 12 hours earlier, but perhaps stopped at 12:15 p.m., about 15 minutes before the fire scene was discovered. He himself was arriving at the same conclusion. It's possible, we cannot prove this, nor can anyone else that we know of involved in that amazing case, that Mrs. Oskey succumbed to an amazing internal combustion within 15 minutes, but it's most unlikely she had 12 hours to do it. In another case that is important to our research, so important that we devoted an entire chapter to it in a book, happened here in Pennsylvania in 1964 outside of Philadelphia. This is the Helen Conway case. And Mrs. Conway, a widow, and several of the victims in our database are widows or widowers, for whatever that might be worth. She was discovered one Sunday morning in November of 1964 in a room filled with very dense black smoke when the firefighters arrived. They brought in the smoke ejectors and quickly discovered that Mrs. Oskey was now basically reduced to a pair of lower legs propped up against the front of her easy chair in a corner of the room. The rest of her body was pretty much amorphous ash, unrecognizable, barely recognizable as a human body. A jewelry bracelet was still dangling from the bone of her left wrist. Minimal fire damage elsewhere. In fact, the fire chief, the deputy fire marshal, and the fire photographer all told us that there was no fire damage directly above the chair in which Mrs. Conway herself incinerated. What is so intriguing to us and so important about the Conway case historically is the time factor. As we said earlier, those who promote the wick effect say that these victims slowly smolder in their own body fat over many, many, many hours. In the Conway case, we don't have that luxury, unless you want to disbelieve all the first responders with whom we were privileged to interview and find the details of this case. In sitting down with Bob Meslin, the fire photographer who later became the fire marshal in Upper Darby Township, where Mrs. Conway met her flaming fate, he told us from the time that the alarm was called in, and Mrs. Conway had supposedly been spoken to by her granddaughter just moments before that happened, until the fire department arrived, the smoke was cleared, and the fire photographer could begin his work. No more than 21 minutes had elapsed. They put that in writing to us. What we learned in sitting down with Bob Meslin was that 21 minutes included the time for him to go leave the fire scene, go home, get his camera, come back to the fire scene, have the smoke ejected, and then he could start taking photographs. If you subtract the time for all those things to happen, then we're down to a maximum of 6 minutes from the time that Mrs. Conway was known to be alive until the fire crew first arrived at the fire scene to find a room full of black smoke but little else. In other words, no serious open flame. And once again, in that case, besides the incredible importance of that time factor, we have firsthand testimony from the fire responders telling us that there was no acrid stench of burned flesh present at the fire scene when they arrived.
That's incredible. That is
incredible. Absolutely incredible.
To go off on a limb here, there are two thoughts running through my mind right now. I believe that the Catholic saints always have a you've been describing a hickory or a sweet smell, and I'm just sitting there thinking, is this, is some of the legend behind the saints of having these aromatic type smells to them? Is it related to this? And then the other thought that's running through my mind is the classic tales of vampires burning up in sunlight. Have you ever tried to connect this at all? These call them legends to possibly modern day phenomena that we still don't understand?
We have not pursued the vampire association that you mentioned, but we certainly have looked into the historical basis that we find in Catholic theology about incendus amoris, the odor of sanctity, the sweet smell, and a chapter in Ablaze to this very subject where saints, holy people, have experienced intense internal burning, sometimes associated with that sweet smell, and its association with spiritual awakening or broader levels of consciousness. We think that is very important to understanding the mechanism that underlies some cases of classic spontaneous human combustion. We need to look at the spiritual aspect of this phenomenon, as well as the biochemical and the bioelectrical. We think that plays a very important role in some of the cases.
That's interesting. Now, speaking of that, you've mentioned the widows. You just mentioned spirituality. Have you looked into the demographics or the age, the sex, the weight, the religions? Do these people all have similarities? Is there a thread of truth or a fine golden thread that's weaving all these people together, being connected somehow?
Another wonderful question. We wish we could give you a simple answer to that because it would make our research so much easier. If there was a commonality to all the victims, we certainly have tried to get the demographic profile of the database. Unfortunately, we have been unable to find any set of common factors to the hundreds of cases that we've been able to document over the last several hundred years, other than that they involved human beings. It used to be claimed again by the Germans and the French back in the 17 and early 1800s that in addition to all victims allegedly being female, they were elderly, they were sedentary, they were alcoholics, they were overweight, and they were either German or they were French. Our research clearly debunks that set of characteristics for victims of SHC. The elderly certainly are more prone to experience the phenomenon, and that's not particularly surprising, at least to us. The biology of the body tends to break down as the body ages. So whatever is the mechanism or mechanisms that culminate in SHC, we would expect them to be associated, at least to some extent, in breakdown of the body's well-being as chronology ensues. That said, in terms of gender in our database, we've been able to determine that 50% of our database of several hundred cases are female, 47% of the database are males, and the remaining 3% history just doesn't tell us the gender. So by gender, by sex, male and females are about equally represented in our database. The oldest victim that seems to fit the definition of SHC is a 114-year-old holy man, Sadhu Singh, who met his interesting flaming fate back in 1970, according to a newspaper account that we have in our files. In that case, he was witnessed by several of his students, his chelas, emanating a blue-green flame from his abdominal region, and at the culmination of the event that consumed his body, the straw mat on which the body had been seated was itself still intact. The antithesis of Sadhu Singh is a 6-week-old toddler in a crib who either spontaneously combusted or his bedding spontaneously combusted and took the toddler with it.
That's incredible. Now, when we're talking about older people, in my mind, we just had a Dr. Melvin Morris on who was talking about near-death experiences, and he's talking about the God spot, and we've had a lot of spiritual type people on the radio program, and you mentioned this about the spirituality connection, and I in my mind I'm wondering is it possibly these time the time for these people to pass on, they're in a dying stage, and I mean, is this potentially something where their brain activates the combustion? I mean, as far as them passing on to another plane of existence, leaving this world, is it literally like a auto combustion self-destruct type mode? Have you made that leap yet to go in that direction of study? Did I make myself clear?
You made yourself very clear, and we are absolutely delighted and enthralled to hear you make that leap. It's one that we have made, and not many people are able to make that leap. Very astute observation and hypothesis. May we commend you. We do posit that in some of the cases, this is the subconscious will, desire, karma of the potential victim to will the body to self-immolate. In the case of Sadhu Singh, we posit, again, we can't offer any support for this other than our belief structure, but we posit that Sadhu Singh, being a holy man, we presume fairly evolved spiritually, probably set up the mechanism in his own consciousness to immolate his physical form so that his students will not have to deal with his physical body after he chose to vacate the corporeal structure that housed his consciousness. Some of the other victims in a blaze may have done the same thing. You know, they may have been a very, very evolved spiritual beings living in this three-dimensional world for the last time in a corporeal body, and this is how they were able to vacate one last time, having evolved their spiritual energy so refined that the body could no longer contain that type of high vibrational frequency. And when their life force separated from the physical form, spontaneous combustion is what ensued.
That's an incredible theory. I mean, that's something really to ponder. That's incredible. Now,
and that is something you never hear about in an arson science course at the National Fire Academy. You know, firefighters just generally, and we've dealt with many of them over several decades now. Some of them are very fine, astute, thoughtful, inquisitive, scientifically oriented thinkers. Many of them, however, are not. You know, it's fight the fire, pour water on it, go to the next fire. We've often pondered and indeed had the opportunity on a few occasions to ask a firefighter who responded to one of these amazing fire scenes, you know, why weren't you curious? And why didn't you pursue this with the dogged determination that we have? And usually what we get back is, you know, well, we're so busy getting called out to the next fire, we just don't really have enough time to think about what happened last week. Sadly the case, but you know, some of us,
sure.
That's why we need their cooperation, because we do want to pursue these. We find this so scientifically and spiritually and intriguing and mentally puzzling. We're looking for answers, and it's been a hoot of a journey for 35 or so years to track down these cases. We've been blessed to meet with some very fine firefighters and first responders and lots of people in the medical community who are open-minded, who are willing to tell us, you know, Larry, we don't have a clue about this, but, you know, bless your heart for pursuing this, and maybe someday we'll all come to an answer.
Now, I want to clarify it's a question, and then I want to give the clarification to it. I guess it's a two-part question. These flames, these people that self-combust, they seem, the people that are afflicted with SHC, they seem to have the flame originate from the abdomen. The first part of that, is it always the abdomen where it originates from? And then the second part of that question is you said y'all did do experiments with pigs. So have you tried to start a fire in a pig's abdomen to see if it spreads?
I love that last one. No, we haven't. Let's go to the first one. Does it always appear to originate in the abdomen? In the classic cases, usually yes. In the survival cases, oftentimes not. Now, as to have we ever attempted to ignite the abdomen of a pig, we have not. We have taken a ham shank, because originally the debunkers would take a piece of fat, wrap it in gauze or mesh, hold it over a Bunsen burner, and of course the fat would begin to burn, and they say, look, this proves the wick theory. Well, no, it doesn't prove anything other than the fat will burn. Hey, candles will burn because it's kind of paraffin-like material. But we did take a ham shank because it included a bone, and in the classic cases, the bone is, calcined to powder. So we have to be able to burn up the bone to powder if we're going to have a credible, reputable experiment to prove the wick effect over spontaneous human combustion. In the experiments that we've done, we've never been able to get the ham shank to incinerate. After an hour of burning a ham shank that was marinated for a year in a mix of brandy and vodka and whiskey, the fire went out, even though it had copious amounts of oxygen to fuel the combustion, and we were left with a ham shank that was still wholly intact. In the experiments involving a whole pig that have been done for programs like Is It Real on National Geo and on several TLC and Discovery programs, in one case the experimenter poured gasoline on the pig to fuel the flames of combustion, which we scream bloody hell about that. Our victims, we don't have an accelerant, and the experimenter initially claimed that he needed the accelerant to raise the heat of combustion necessary so that the fat would begin to render out of the pig. And that experiment and many others that he has done have taken many, many hours. The pig has never been fully consumed. And in several experiments, the pig is actually, led to a room, a near flashover condition in the burn chamber. Everything is burning up, and fire suppression equipment has been rushed in to quell the blazing inferno. And yet that researcher will stand there at the end of his experiment and say, look, I proved the wick theory. No, you didn't. You disproved the wick theory. At least in terms of applying it to spontaneous human combustion classic cases.
Absolutely. I've got a couple questions from the members at the SHTF411.com chat room. Now, clarify if I'm wrong, but didn't you disprove that? Is alcoholism a prime link with the victims, or is that not the case?
It's present in some victims. Other victims are teetotalers. Dr. Bentley, for example, did not drink alcohol. George Mott, another classic case of SHC that happened in upstate New York in March of 1986. We devote a full chapter to his case, the first time the case was ever publicly discussed at length. He was a retired firefighter, of all things, very, very cautious about fire in his domicile. He was not a consumer of alcohol. We do consider alcohol as being a possible cause for some of the cases in that it will break down body tissues in a way that can lead to combustible byproducts. The debunkers, of course, say, well, alcoholics are drunk in a drunken stupor and simply unaware that they've fallen into the fireplace or dropped a cigarette on their lap. But, that certainly is true. But does it lead to spontaneous human combustion? Those types of fires happen all too frequently in this country and around the world, and we don't have hundreds and thousands of cases of ashen bodies because people have dropped cigarettes on themselves annually. It just doesn't happen. If it does happen, we're overlooking a lot of cases.
Sure. Now, have you done statistical odds? There are people that say spontaneous human combustion is caused by ball lightning. Have you ever looked at the odds? I mean, what do you think of the ball lightning theory involved in this situation?
Ball lightning, plasma-type orbs are definitely a mechanism by which spontaneous human combustion has occurred and can occur. Will it explain all the cases? Absolutely not. But it will explain some of them, and we document some of those cases in our book Ablaze. What are the odds? What are the odds of seeing ball lightning, let alone being struck by? Extremely small. Until about 2 decades ago, we believed ball lightning is one of those phenomena witnessed by who knows how many people, reported by who knows how many people, but steadfastly obligatorily debunked and dismissed by mainstream science.
It didn't fit neatly into their clean box of official
Right.
science.
Yep. They didn't like the box because it fell outside the box. They would not allow it into the box until fairly recently. Now we can replicate, or we can produce ball lightning in the laboratory. Wow, it's cool. It exists. Well, yes, it's existed for a very long time. You guys just didn't recognize it.
Now, in your studies, have you ever looked into the people that can claim to generate heat through their hands at will?
We have, and again, we devote part of our blaze to looking at TUMO and to people who are pyrokinetics, able to generate apparently at will, on demand, high temperatures in themselves or in objects that they handle. Healers are notorious for generating heat by touch or by proximity to a patient. We have some personal experience with that ourselves. So once again, looking at a variety of mechanisms that have a strong support in the medical, in the metaphysical, particularly in the Eastern medical literature, that can lend itself to trying to understand some of the processes that underlie spontaneous human combustion. Unfortunately, a lot of this material is not available in Western medicine or acceptable within Western medicine. There are exceptions, of course, as you probably know. One that we know about is Dr. Lisa Nella out in San Francisco, who looked at Kundalini and transcendence, and how this Kundalini energy, well known within the Eastern medical community, can be studied within the context of Western medicine. And Kundalini is another one of those quasi-electrical energies that all living human beings possess, we believe, that can in some cases become so out of balance that it can cause the body's thermogenesis to rise very, very rapidly, and probably is another mechanism by which some cases of spontaneous human combustion can best be explained.
Now, for the record, from what I'm hearing so far, I'm an absolute firm believer in this now, and I do lean toward, you're talking about the Kundalini, and we were talking about a higher spiritual self. I'm really believing that this is the predominantly a spiritual aspect of a expanded mind. But I want to ask a few more questions in regards to physical conditions that could potentially cause this. Now, these are from the chat room on the shtf411.com forum board. Do you see body oils or greases on the body having a contributing effect to SHC?
We presume the questioner is looking at those oils or greases as being external on the dermis?
Yes.
Probably not. We're hesitant to rule out anything in this phenomenon because it is so bizarre and nonsensical and defies much that is logical to begin with. But at the moment, we're stretching credulity to imagine how oil or grease on the exterior surface of the skin would lead to internal combustion or internal burning of some sort.
Good point. This seems like it's occurring internally out. Now, on that point, is it possible for, let's say, if someone has an enlarged intestine that's expanded with gas, can that slowly leak out into the body, causing a SHC scenario?
If the intestine is damaged or ripped, or in a particular person is highly porous, we would think the gastrointestinal vapors could exude out, but we still would need to find an ignition mechanism to light that gas and cause it to flame.
I can see that. Now, we've got about 9 minutes left, so I've got one or two more questions. Have you ever been contacted by shows like the X-Files or CSI or other primetime shows to ask your expertise on this subject? Have they? Do you know of any of those shows using SHC as a prime focus of a show?
Yeah, X-Files had a couple of episodes that dealt with pyrophenomena. Chris Carter never contacted us. Maybe we have a sense that sometimes they picked up a copy of Ablaze or some of our writings. Never personally. CSI did an episode, we think it was season 2. Memory might not be correct in that, but CSI did do a show that opened with spontaneous human combustion, and they characterized it quite accurately as a classic scene, and it really looked good. And I'm thinking, wow, we're going to get some good PR out of this one. And at the end, Mr. Grissom decided, nope, it's the Wick effect. There's no mystery. We were quite disappointed, as you can well imagine, because, frankly, we don't think Mr. Grissom got the solution correct. We have certainly not seen the Wick effect proven. In fact, one of the promoters, may we say, of the Wick effect has actually lied on camera about the alleged success of his experiment. If you have to misrepresent your science to promote your claim is bogus.
I agree. Absolutely. So, with your studies, where are they taking you now? I mean, are you planning on a book in the near future, or where is this going now? I mean, to me, I see a sequel based off the spirituality aspect of this, because after talking to you, that's what I'm coming away with, is that this is some kind of internally caused process.
Well, we'll have to give that some consideration. Appreciate the inspiration, perhaps. That would probably have to come out as fiction only. We don't know anyway at the moment that we could, take that premise and put it in the laboratory under controlled conditions to prove that spirituality has a direct association with spontaneous human combustion. But as fiction, it could work really well. Certainly, we continue to be in contact with researchers around the planet, some real clear-thinking individuals who have some interesting concepts based on their own considerations and musings about SponCom and other Fortean phenomena. Where this leads at this point is probably anybody's guess. We never thought we would have 35 years of our life devoted to this one subject, but as we said earlier, it's been an amazing adventure, and we have learned so much, and we enjoy sharing what we've learned so far with individuals like you, particularly clear thinkers like you, who have posed some very thoughtful questions to us. We've enjoyed this interview immensely.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, we have, at the end of the interviews, we have the charity that you want to promote. Will you go ahead and plug that charity for us?
This is an absolutely wonderful concept. This is the first show that we've done in hundreds and hundreds of radio interviews that has ever come up with a charity to promote based on the speaker's interest. And we do have one for you. It's called Bunny People. Bunny as in bunny rabbit. Here in Harrisburg, there is a Bunny People group that rescues domestic rabbits that are thrown out on the street by care tenders who no longer decide that they want to give care to a rabbit. We foster it, we spay and neuter it, and then look for an adopted family that will give it the proper care and love and shelter that domestic rabbits deserve and warrant. Bunny People can be reached at P.O. Box 6441, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania 17112. Or you can go to our website, which again is Parascience, PARAscience.com, and email us through the website, and we'll certainly be able to get you in touch with the people who are deeply involved in Bunny People. We have had pet rabbits ourselves for a number of years, have one right now. They make tremendously wonderful indoor pets. They have individual personalities just like dogs do. Can't say cats. Maybe cats, but certainly dogs have individual personalities. Rabbits do too. And they make wonderful indoor pets. And Bunny People is a wonderful organization that shelters and readopts rabbits out to loving homes. So that's a charity for you. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to do that.
I love that. I love the idea of buddy people. That's an interesting. It's a noble charity. Um, yeah, it is. All right. Before we go, will you give us your information, your website, where we can learn more about this, and please.
Absolutely. It is parascience.com. Drill down. It's not the world's greatest website. A friend put it up for us, bless her heart. But drill down, and if you have information that you want about a case or about the phenomenon, or if you think you have a lead to suggest to us that we can research, please contact us through the website. The email address is there, and we'll be delighted to share with whoever responds to the website what information we have available about the subject. The book, again, is ablaze. It retails for $24.95. Order it through Amazon.com or directly through our own website, and the latter will get you a personally inscribed copy. We'll pick up shipping and handling to the United States or Canada. It reads like a Stephen King horror novel, we're told, but it's based on good, solid historical research and documentation. You will see photographs you have never imagined could exist. You will learn about cases that have been truly lost to history until our research discovered them, brought them back to the fore, and radiant heat source. If you can rule out those common situations that can lead to burning of the flesh, then you need to look at spontaneous human combustion.
Now, I've read. Now, with that definition, that rules out a lot of the more commonly, I should say, the orthodox explanations of it. I've read that there are alcohol poisoning, wicking, where if you drop, they say it's wicking if you drop a cigarette. I wish you would explain that one for me. Wicking, and then static electricity. But what you just said rules all of those out. Am I correct?
We would certainly believe so. That's why we like to stick with that definition, so that, as we said, we all are working from common ground. You mentioned the wicking phenomenon, or the wicking theory to explain away spontaneous human combustion. That is by far the most prevalent theory that the naysayers, the debunkers, the so-called skeptics proffer as the explain-away for spontaneous human combustion, something that they are really, really uncomfortable having to deal with.
Now, how many times has this been documented throughout history? When did it begin?
Oh, when did it begin? In our book Ablaze, we devote a chapter that looks at mythology and legends with an eye to maybe these being historically accurate accounts of some very strange phenomena involving burning of people. And if we accept those as based on historical fact, we have evidence for spontaneous human combustion going back thousands of years. In Ablaze, we document in excess of, I think the count is around 500 cases, maybe 400 in a book. We found more since the book was published in 1995. I think Ablaze contains about 400 cases that fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion in most cases.
Wow.
A couple of cases we report in the book that were alleged by other reporters, other investigators, journalists to be spontaneous human combustion, and we found evidence that found a prosaic, commonplace, albeit and oftentimes very bizarre situation, not spontaneous, and see if whether or not there was supporting documentation from 1951 in the local newspapers down in Florida to support Frank Edwards' chapter about Mrs. Reeser's alleged strange fiery fate. And what we found was that Frank Edwards, being a newspaper man himself, had archived these newspapers and reported the story in his book quite accurately. The officials back in July of 1951 in St. Pete, Florida, were completely mystified about how Mrs. Reeser, who was about a 175-pound widow one night, the following morning was found reduced to a pile of pretty much desiccated powder in her apartment in St. Pete. Her ashes, her 1 foot, few pieces of calcined vertebrae, plus the remnants of the chair in which she had last been known to be seated, weighed less than 10 pounds. And there was minimal fire damage elsewhere in the apartment. And this certainly fit the classic definition of spontaneous human combustion. And so we decided to see whether, Mrs. Reeser was an absolutely unique one-off case, or whether there might be similar cases throughout history that fit the same description of the fate that befell her. And 35 years or so later, we found hundreds of cases that are very similar to what befell Mrs. Reeser in 1951.
Now, a lot of people out there, I've got to ask, I mean, can you go into detail what spontaneous human combustion is exactly? I mean, I've read that there are a million different theories out there, but in a nutshell, I mean, it is where the body just burns. Is that correct, or is there a more in-depth definition to it?
Yeah, great place to start. Let's give you our definition of spontaneous human combustion so that we all have a common ground from which to base the rest of the discussion, and we'll see where we go from here. Our definition of SHC is the phenomenon process whereby a person can smoke, blister, or otherwise combust in absence of contact with a known, identifiable, nearby external ignition source or burn agent. That is, the person burns, blisters, or smokes in the absence of contact with a flame, in the absence of caustic chemicals or radioactive material or high amperage or a nearby known.
All right, folks, we're back on the air. We've got Larry E. Arnold talking about spontaneous human combustion. Welcome to the show, sir. You are on the air.
Thank you, Sean. So absolutely delighted to be with you and your audience this evening. We have a hot topic to discuss, don't we?
A hot topic, yes, we do. I smoke cigars, and ever since I started reading about this, I've never really been interested, but I was looking into it for this interview, and I've had a twinge on the back of my mind of am I going to combust? So
it's an unnerving subject. The odds are in favor, though, that you're not going to have that happen to you tonight.
So, how did you get involved in this topic? I mean, it's an interesting topic, and it's one that, I mean, you've actually written an entire book on this. What was the thing that spurred you into this? I mean, what was the driving attraction, the driving force in this?
Innate curiosity about things that seem to have fairly decent documentation to back up the allegation, the claim, the event, and if it falls outside the understanding or the acceptance of mainstream orthodox science, then that intrigues us all the more. And certainly SPON-COM fits that criterion. We were introduced to the subject when we were in junior high school. We purchased one of those paperback books for a quarter called Stranger Than Science by Frank Edwards. And in that book, Mr. Edwards wrote a chapter about the Cinder Woman, Mary Hardy Reeser, who he said, evidence contended, burned by spontaneous human combustion in St. Petersburg, Florida in 1951. Classic case at the time, generated a lot of headlines. But we never heard much more about it as we went through secondary school, and when we went to college, we asked some of our professors about it, and they had never heard of the concept of spontaneous human combustion.
Did they look at you funny?
Some of them did, and some of them said basically, well, I don't know about it, but I don't know enough to say it can't happen, which is, a very honest intellectual attitude to take. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When we left college, we left electrical engineering. We got interested again in spontaneous human combustion, and we decided we'd go down to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., get into the microfilm archives in the newspaper section, and human combustion, but very strange fire deaths nonetheless. So we're not a mystery monger, as some of our critics allege. We're not looking to say everybody who burns up has to be a victim of spontaneous human combustion. That would be ludicrous. Unfortunately, in this country alone, about 4,500 people a year are fire fatalities. Very few, if any of them, resemble the classic case of spontaneous human combustion, i.e., like Mrs. Reeser or Dr. John Bentley, also here in Pennsylvania, or many other cases that we document in depth in our book Ablaze.
Now, when we look at the classic, can you run over what the classic scenario is? I mean, it entails the fact that nothing else is burnt. That is part of it, isn't it?
That's part of the classic scene, and thank you for using the adjective classic. What we're going to be describing next is how many people think of spontaneous human combustion. We found in our research that the phenomenon has a wide variety of aspects and presentations, so that, as we said in our definition originally, a person whose body will blister spontaneously is a victim of spontaneous human combustion, even though that person is able to talk about it and show the blister to a physician or to a next of kin, for example. But the classic case, what most people think of in spontaneous human combustion research, is a fire scene in which the body is almost wholly reduced to powder, desiccated ash, which normally in a retort would require temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees for many hours uninterrupted. At the scene of classic spontaneous human combustion, the body is almost completely obliterated. Perhaps an extremity or two is left, a foot, a hand, perhaps the head, sometimes even shrunken, to indicate that the ash itself once belonged to a human body. The paradox there is that most people think this must require a tremendous amount of heat, and certainly it does in a crematorium's retort. But yet at a classic SHC fire scene, we do not find the evidence of extreme heat near the body. Stacks of newspapers, daybed linen, tar-based linoleum flooring, paint on the ceiling above the point of combustion where the individual incinerated, do not exhibit any kind of extreme heat or fire damage.
That's incredible. You said something that just, it did actually send shivers up my spine because, coincidentally, now a couple of years ago I did burn myself pretty good with some hot grease, actually on my stomach. But about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, I have no way to explain it. I mean, this is for real. No way to explain it. But just above where those burns occurred, I ended up with, it's about 1.5 inches long and about a 1/2 inch wide, that they were burn blisters. And I literally do not know how they got there. I did not burn myself. I did not drop ash on myself. I did not burn myself with more bacon grease. Mm-hmm. But I've got a scar it's still there. I don't know when it's going to go away. It was from about 2 weeks ago. So what causes that? I mean, let's get into the cause of this, because now I'm a little concerned.
We're jumping from the frying pan right into the fire, so to speak. What causes spontaneous human combustion? You alluded to earlier there being a million theories. There may well be. We haven't come up with that many ourselves. Blaze documents or suggest about 120 different plausible, possible explanations for the different cases of SponCom that we document. We look at biochemistry, we look at bioelectricity, we look at quantum physics, we look at geotelluric energy patterns, because we have found in some cases, particularly in the United Kingdom, when we plot the locations of very bizarre fires involving humans, animals, and property on a map of the UK, a large percentage of those strange, anomalous fires fall along straight alignments. More than 80% of the cases that we would characterize as bizarre can be connected by straight alignments when plotted on a map. Some alignments extend for several hundred miles across the British landscape.
So are we talking